I didn't wake up in a bed of furs, nor was I swept into the arms of some fated lover. I woke up with my face pressed into freezing mud, smelling wet ash, horse manure, and the copper tang of my own split lip. They called me Omega, the dirt beneath their claws. I thought my only job was to survive the brutal winter. I had no idea the angry, burning scar hidden under my tangled hair was a death sentence, or that it belonged to the terrifying alpha who ruled us all. The first thing you learn at the bottom of the pack is how to make yourself small. It is not a metaphor. It is a physical reshaping of the spine. Consciousness returned to me not with a gentle dawn, but with the sharp toe of a leather boot driving into my ribs. I gasped, choking on the icy morning air. Sleet pelted my back. My fingers curled into the frozen earth were blue and cracked, the nails caked in black dirt. "Get up. The fires are dead, you useless cur." The voice belonged to Rita. She was a beta, broad-shouldered and smelling heavily of wood smoke, old sweat, and the sour ale she had undoubtedly been drinking until dawn. I didn't look at her face. Looking meant a challenge. A challenge meant teeth in my throat. I rolled onto my knees, my joints screaming in protest. A ragged wool tunic hung off my emaciated frame, heavy with dampness. I didn't remember how I got here. My memories before the fever that nearly killed me a week ago were a fractured, useless mess. Shadows of another life, a warmer place, a different name. Now I was just Omega, the nameless meat of the Winterridge pack. "I'm up," I rasped. My throat felt like it was lined with crushed glass. Reda snorted, kicking a clump of frozen mud at my knees before turning away. "Haul water for the horses. The hunting party returns before midday. If the troughs are empty, I'll have your hide stretching on the racks." I dragged myself upright. The world tilted, a blurry wash of grey skies and the jagged black silhouettes of the surrounding pine forest. The settlement was a crude collection of longhouses built from massive timber and stone, huddled together against the biting wind. It smelled of roasting marrow, wet dog, and the sharp, metallic sting of freshly spilled blood from the butchering blocks. I grabbed the wooden yoke and the two splintering buckets. Every step toward the river was a negotiation with gravity. The wind whipped my matted hair across my face. I reached up to push it back, my frozen fingers grazing the nape of my neck. A sharp, searing pain shot down my spine. I hissed, dropping my hand. The mark. I didn't know when I got it, but it was there beneath my hair, resting where the neck met the shoulder blades. It wasn't a tattoo. It was a raised, silvery scar, hot to the touch. It felt like a jagged crescent moon tangled in a mess of thorny briars. Whenever the wind shifted, carrying the scent of the deeper woods, the scar burned like a pressed coal. I kept it hidden. In a place where weakness was a crime, an unexplained deformity was a death sentence. By the time I hauled the third yoke of freezing river water up the muddy embankment, the horns blew. A low, resonant blast that vibrated in the marrow of my bones. The hunting party. I dumped the water into the hollowed-out log troughs just as the heavy wooden gates of the palisade groaned open. The ground shuddered under the hooves of a dozen massive war horses. The pack warriors rode in, exhausted, covered in a mix of road dirt, snow, and the dark, tacky stains of dried blood. At the head of the column rode Samuel. He didn't look like the romanticized lords in the old songs. He was a warlord. Massive, heavily scarred, his dark hair pulled back into a severe knot. His cloak was made from the pelt of a bear, and his armor was battered iron and boiled leather. As he rode past, the air pressure dropped. It was a suffocating physical weight. My instincts, this new, humiliating biology I was trapped in, screamed at me to drop to my knees and bare my neck. My knees actually buckled, hitting the mud with a wet slap. I hated it. I hated the submission, the complete override of my own will. I bit the inside of my cheek until it bled, staring fiercely at the mud churning beneath his horse's hooves. Samuel abruptly pulled down on his reins. His massive black destrier snorted, coming to a halt mere feet from where I knelt. The entire courtyard went deadly quiet. The ambient noise of the blacksmith's hammer, the barking hounds, the shouting women, it all evaporated. I held my breath. The smell of him washed over me. It wasn't just sweat and horse, it was ozone. It was crushed pine needles, cold iron, and something darker. A deep, hollow sorrow that smelled like wet ash. My scar flared, a sudden blinding heat that made my vision swim. Samuel didn't speak. He just sat there in the saddle, his heavy gaze sweeping over the courtyard. I could hear the slow, deliberate intake of his breath through his nose. He was scenting the air. "Alpha?" Rita's voice was cautious, stripped of all her earlier arrogance. Samuel remained perfectly still for a painfully long moment. Then he let out a harsh breath, dismissed whatever ghost he thought he'd caught, and spurred his horse forward toward the great hall. I let out a trembling breath, my hands shaking so violently I couldn't grip the edges of my buckets. I didn't know what just happened, but I knew one thing. I had to stay as far away from the Alpha as possible. 3 days passed in an agonizing blur of labor. When you are the lowest rung of the pack, there is no romance to the medieval life. It is blisters, shivering, and the perpetual hollow ache of a stomach that runs on scraps. They put me on the tanning vats. It was a punishment, likely for taking too long at the river the day the Alpha returned. The vats were located downwind of the settlement, and for good reason. The stench was a physical wall, a vile mixture of stale urine, wood ash, and mashed animal brains used to soften the deer hides. I stood knee-deep in a vat of cold water, my arms plunged into the foul slurry, violently scraping the hair and fat from a heavy pelt. My hands were pruned, cracked, and weeping clear fluid. Every movement sent a jolt of pain up my forearms. "Work it deeper, Omega, or you won't get a crust of bread tonight." A passing guard sneered, spitting a wad of chewed root onto the ground near my bare, muddy feet. I didn't answer. I just gritted my teeth, digging the dull edge of my scraping bone into the hide. I was exhausted, cynical, and deeply bitter. Whatever cosmic joke had placed me in this miserable, bruised body had a sick sense of humor. By dusk, the work was finally done. I dragged myself out of the vats, smelling so foul that even the pack's mangy stray dogs gave me a wide berth. I was desperate to wash. I couldn't go into the sleeping quarters smelling like rotting fat. The others would beat me and throw me out into the snow. I bypassed the settlement entirely, slipping through a gap in the wooden palisade, and headed toward the dense pine forest. There was a small, fast-moving creek about a mile in. It was dangerous to leave the territory borders. Rogue wolves and rival scouts roamed the deep woods, but I was too tired to care if I lived or died. The forest was silent, the ground blanketed in a fresh layer of white powder. The cold was a sharp knife against my wet clothes, but the isolation was a rare, precious comfort. I found the creek. The water was black and fast, a thin crust of ice clinging to the reeds at the banks. I didn't hesitate. I stripped off my heavy, foul-smelling tunic and the coarse linen undershift, standing naked in the freezing wind. I shivered violently, my skin erupting in gooseflesh. I waded in. The water was so cold it felt like fire. It seized my lungs, stealing my breath. I frantically scrubbed at my skin with handfuls of coarse river sand, trying to scrape the stench of the tanning vats from my pores. I paused, gasping for air, and caught my reflection in a still eddy near the bank. I looked like a corpse. Hollow cheeks, dark circles under my eyes, collarbones sharp enough to cut glass. I turned slightly, looking over my shoulder. There it was. The mark. In the pale moonlight, it seemed to glow with a faint, unnatural silver light. I reached back, tracing the jagged ridges of the scar tissue. It was warm. It was always warm. Crack. The sound of a heavy branch snapping echoed through the quiet woods. I froze. My heart slammed against my ribs like a trapped bird. I didn't turn around. I didn't breathe. You are outside the perimeter." The voice was a low, guttural rumble. It didn't belong to a guard. It belonged to Samuel. Panic, absolute and blinding, flooded my veins. I scrambled out of the water, slipping on the icy rocks, my hands frantically grabbing for my discarded linen shift. I pulled it over my head, the coarse fabric sticking to my wet skin, clinging to every shivering contour of my body. It offered no warmth and less modesty, but it covered the back of my neck. I dropped to the snow, burying my face in my knees, crossing my arms over my head. The ultimate posture of submission. I heard his boots crunching in the snow. Slow, deliberate. The suffocating weight of his presence pressed down on the clearing, heavy enough to make the air feel thick and unbreathable. The scent of ozone and crushed pine rolled over me, burying the smell of the river and the snow. He stopped inches from where I huddled. I could see the scuffed, iron-reinforced toes of his boots. Look at me. I didn't want to. I wanted the earth to open up and swallow me. But the command was laced with alpha authority. It bypassed my brain and tugged directly at the muscles in my neck. I slowly raised my head, trembling violently, my wet hair clinging to my face. Samuel was towering over me. He wasn't wearing his armor, just a heavy dark tunic and a thick fur mantle. In the moonlight, the grey streaks in his beard were silver. His eyes, a startling, piercing amber, locked onto mine. He frowned, a tiny furrow appearing between his heavy brows. He crouched down, his movements terrifyingly fluid for a man of his size. He was close enough now that I could feel the heat radiating from his body. He leaned in slightly. The breath caught in my throat. He was scenting me again. I knew I smelled of freezing river water, cheap lye soap, and the lingering, awful ghost of the tanning vats. But underneath it all, my scar began to throb. A sharp, rhythmic pulsing. Samuel's amber eyes widened a fraction of an inch. His hand twitched, rising halfway as if to reach for my shoulder. "Who?" he started, his voice suddenly hoarse, stripped of its harsh command. "I'm sorry," I blurted out, my voice cracking. "I just needed to wash. I won't do it again, please." I shrank back, burying my face back into my knees, preparing for a blow. I expected a strike. I expected him to drag me back to the settlement by my hair. Silence stretched. The wind howled through the high branches of the pines. When I finally dared to open my eyes, the space in front of me was empty. There were only deep boot prints in the snow, leading back toward the darkness of the trees. He had walked away. I sat alone in the freezing snow, my hands clutching the damp linen shift to my chest, entirely unaware that the nightmare was only just beginning. The great hall was a cavernous, smoke-filled belly of noise and heat. It was the night of the blood moon, a sacred gathering for the pack that involved a sickening amount of roasted pork, heavy drinking, and barely contained violence. The air was thick with the smell of rendered animal fat, spilled ale, and the musky, aggressive scent of 100 wolves crammed into one room. Massive iron braziers blazed down the center of the hall, casting long, frantic shadows against the timber walls. I was on serving duty. It was a dangerous job. Drunk wolves were unpredictable, and an omega carrying a heavy tray was an easy target for their aggression. My arms ached as I balanced a massive wooden platter piled high with smoking, grease-slicked venison. I kept my eyes on the floor, navigating the maze of sprawling bodies, hunting dogs, and overturned stools. "Move, Kerr." A heavy elbow slammed into my shoulder. I stumbled, struggling to keep the tray level. Searing hot grease sloshed over the edge, raining down on my bare forearm. I hissed, biting down hard on my lower lip to swallow the scream. The skin instantly blistered, turning a violent shade of red. I didn't drop the tray. Dropping the meat meant a flogging. I steadied myself, blinking back the hot tears of pain, and kept moving. At the far end of the hall sat the high table, It was elevated on a wooden dais, removed from the chaotic mud and spilled ale of the lower floor. Samuel sat in the center, flanked by his beta, Reader, and the pack elders. He looked exhausted. He held a massive horn of mead, but he wasn't drinking. He was just staring into the middle distance, his jaw tight. As I approached the high table to deliver the meat, I caught snippets of the conversation. "It has been 5 winters, Samuel," an elder named Oswin was saying. His voice was slurred, his face flushed with drink. "The pack needs an Luna. You cannot mourn a ghost forever. The Winterborn cannot be ruled by a half-empty throne." The temperature around the high table plummeted. The ambient chatter from the nearby tables died off, replaced by a tense, nervous silence. Samuel slowly turned his head to look at Oswin. He didn't growl. He didn't raise his voice. He simply set his mead horn down on the heavy oak table. The sound it made was quiet, but it echoed like a gunshot. "Do not speak of her, Oswin," Samuel said. His voice was smooth, deadly, and terrifyingly calm. "Do not speak of what the pack needs. My mate was taken. Her bones were never found. Until they are, my mark belongs to her." I froze, standing just at the edge of the dais, the heavy tray of venison trembling in my burned hands. His mate. I had heard the whispers in the kitchens. Years ago, before Samuel was fully established as Alpha, a rival pack had ambushed his hunting party. His fated mate, a woman he had just marked, was lost to the river during the slaughter. "She is dead, Alpha." A female voice cut in. It was Clara. She sat at the table just below the dais. She was high-ranking, beautiful in a sharp, predatory way, and she had been vying for Samuel's attention for years. "It is a tragedy, but a wolf must eventually accept the winter. Let the dead rest." Samuel's amber eyes flashed, a terrifying feral gold ring illuminating his irises. Before he could react, Clara stood up, pushing her chair back violently. She bumped directly into me. "Watch yourself, Omega!" Clara shrieked, batting at her fine woolen dress. A single drop of grease had landed on her sleeve. "I apologize," I whispered, bowing my head instantly. Clara was humiliated by the tension at the high table and needed a target. She backhanded me. The strike was blindingly fast, a blur of motion. A heavy silver ring caught my cheekbone, tearing the skin. The force of the blow spun me around. I lost my grip on the platter. It crashed to the floor, hot venison and grease scattering across the stone hearth. I fell hard onto my hands and knees, my burned arm screaming in agony. "You stupid, clumsy animal!" Clara spat, stepping forward. She grabbed the collar of my rough linen tunic, intending to haul me up and strike me again. She pulled hard. The cheap, rotted fabric tore. The loud "rip" echoed in the sudden silence of the hall. The back of my tunic ripped open, peeling away from my skin, exposing my shoulder blades and the back of my neck to the harsh light of the roaring braziers. The scar burned. It didn't just throb, it felt like a white-hot branding iron being pressed into my flesh. Someone gasped. Clara froze, her hand still clutching my torn collar. She was staring down at my neck, the blood draining from her face, leaving her pale and horrified. I scrambled to pull the fabric back up, my hands trembling wildly. But it was too late. The sound of a heavy wooden chair being violently pushed back shattered the silence. I looked up through the curtain of my hair. Samuel was on his feet. He looked like he had been struck by lightning. His amber eyes were locked onto my exposed neck, his pupils dilated so wide his eyes looked entirely black. The entire mead hall held its breath. Samuel vaulted over the high table. He didn't use the stairs. He landed on the floorboards with a heavy thud, his boots crushing the spilled meat. Clara scrambled backward, terrified, dropping my collar. I tried to crawl away. My survival instincts were screaming at me to run, to hide, to get away from the apex predator stalking toward me. But my limbs felt like lead. Samuel dropped to his knees in the grease and the dirt right in front of me. He reached out. His hand was shaking. His large, calloused fingers brushed against my neck, pushing my tangled hair aside. The moment his skin touched the raised, silvery scar, a shock wave of heat rushed through my entire body. It was a tether snapping taut, a lock clicking into place. Samuel let out a sound I will never forget. It was a ragged, broken exhale, halfway between a sob and a vicious, possessive growl. He gripped my shoulders, his fingers digging into my bruises, and hauled me upward until my face was inches from his. His chest was heaving, his amber eyes burning into mine with an intensity that terrified me to my core. "Where?" he whispered, his voice trembling with a terrifying, devastating rage. "Where did you get this mark?" The silence in the mead hall was a living, breathing thing. It pressed against my eardrums, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the crackle of the iron braziers and the ragged, wet sound of Samuel's breathing. His fingers were iron vices on my shoulders. The heat transferring from his skin to my raised scar was a localized inferno. It didn't feel romantic. It felt like an invasive biological override, a violent snapping together of two frayed wires. My stomach lurched. The grease burn on my forearm throbbed in rhythm with my racing heart, a sharp, grounding counterpoint to the chaotic heat radiating from my neck. "Answer me," Samuel growled. The sound vibrated deep in his massive chest, a frequency that made my teeth ache. I couldn't speak. My throat was clamped shut with terror. I looked at his face. The warlord was gone. The man kneeling in the spilled meat and grease was a fractured, desperate animal. His amber eyes flicked frantically over my dirt-streaked face, searching for a ghost in my hollow cheeks and bruised jaw. "Alpha." Oswin's voice cut through the stillness, cautious but laced with sudden, sharp authority. The elder stepped down from the dais, his heavy boots crunching on dropped bones. "She is an Omega, a nameless stray. It is a trick, blood magic, or a rogue's deception." Samuel didn't look at him. He didn't even blink. "Shut your mouth, Oswin, before I tear it from your face." The casual, flat delivery of the threat made the blood drain from the elder's face. Oswin stopped dead. Samuel's gaze remained locked on me. He released my left shoulder, his large hand moving slowly, almost hesitantly, up my neck. His thumb traced the jagged line of my jaw, wiping away a smear of soot and dried blood. His touch was jarringly gentle against the backdrop of his towering rage. "Who are you?" he whispered. The question meant only for me. "I don't know," I rasped. My voice sounded pathetic, a dry scrape of vocal cords. "I don't remember." It was the truth. The hollow cavern in my mind offered nothing but the memory of waking up in the freezing mud a week ago. Clara, who had backed away until she hit a heavy wooden pillar, finally found her voice. It was shrill, tinged with a hysterical panic. "She is lying. Look at her, Samuel. She is filth. She stole that mark." Samuel's head snapped toward her. The sheer predatory violence in his expression made Clara choke on her words. "You struck her," he said. The words dropped like stones into a frozen pond. Clara swallowed hard, her eyes darting to the ripped collar of my tunic, then to the angry red burn blistering on my arm. She dropped the meat. She is clumsy and useless. I was enforcing discipline. "You struck what carries my mark." Samuel interrupted, rising slowly to his feet. The air pressure in the room shifted again. He didn't yell. He didn't posture. He simply stood up, his massive frame blocking the light from the braziers, casting a long, terrifying shadow over Clara. "Samuel, please," she stammered, flattening herself against the pillar. "Reader," Samuel said, not breaking eye contact with Clara. The broad-shouldered beta stepped forward instantly. "Alpha, confine Clara to the lower cells. She is stripped of her rank until the elders convene to weigh her punishment." A collective gasp rippled through the hall, stripping a high-ranking female of her status and sending her to the freezing underground holding cells over a reprimanded Omega was unheard of. It defied the brutal established hierarchy of the pack. Clara opened her mouth to scream, to protest. But Rada was already there, her heavy hand clamping down on Clara's arm with bone-bruising force. Samuel turned his back on them. He looked down at me. I was still kneeling in the dirt, shivering violently in my torn, damp linen shift, clutching my burned arm to my chest. I expected him to command me to stand, to drag me up by my good arm. Instead, he stooped down and swept me into his arms. I flinched hard, a pathetic, involuntary reaction to being handled. My rigid body went entirely stiff against his chest. He smelled of crushed pine, hot iron, and mead. It was overwhelming. His heavy fur mantle brushed against my bare skin, soft and foreign. "Call for Beatrice," Samuel ordered, projecting his voice across the silent hall. "Bring her to my quarters. Now." He carried me out of the mead hall. I kept my eyes squeezed shut, burying my face awkwardly into the crook of my own arm, unable to process the jarring transition. 20 minutes ago, I was dirt. Now I was being carried by the apex predator of the Winterridge pack. The internal contradiction made me nauseous. I didn't feel rescued. I felt like a trapped rabbit carried in the jaws of a wolf. The Alpha's quarters were located in the highest part of the stone keep. The transition from the chaotic, reeking mead hall to this space was jarring. It was quiet here. The thick stone walls swallowed the wind. The room smelled of clean wood ash, dried lavender, and beeswax. Samuel set me down on a massive bed piled high with thick, heavy furs. I scrambled backward the moment my feet touched the mattress, pressing myself against the rough-hewn timber headboard. The furs felt alien, too soft against my bruised, scabby skin. I pulled my knees to my chest, my breathing shallow and fast. I was a wild, cornered thing, completely out of my element. Samuel didn't crowd me. He stepped back, his hands resting on his hips, watching me with a heavy, unreadable expression. The golden ring in his amber eyes was still pronounced, a sign of his wolf riding close to the surface. "Stop shaking," he said quietly. It wasn't an order. It was a plea. I couldn't stop. The adrenaline was crashing, leaving me hollowed out and freezing, despite the massive hearth blazing against the far wall. The grease burn on my forearm was beginning to weep, a blinding, localized agony. The heavy oak door swung open. A woman bustled in, carrying a leather satchel that smelled sharply of bitter herbs and rubbing alcohol. Beatrice. She was older, her grey hair woven into a tight, no-nonsense braid. Her apron was stained with years of crushed poultices and blood. She took one look at the room. The Alpha standing rigidly by the fire. And me, an emaciated, filthy Omega huddled on his pristine furs. And her jaw tightened. She didn't ask questions. She simply pulled a wooden stool to the edge of the bed. "Bring me a basin of hot water and clean linen, Alpha," Beatrice said, her tone brisk and entirely devoid of the fear the others showed him. "And then give us the room. You are suffocating her." Samuel's jaw clenched. For a second I thought he would refuse. His eyes darted to the mark on my exposed neck, a violent possessiveness warring with his rationality. Then he gave a curt nod, turned, and strode out, the heavy door clicking shut behind him. The oppressive weight in the room lifted instantly. I let out a long, shuddering breath I didn't know I was holding. Beatrice moved methodically. When Samuel returned with the water and left again, she began to clean my arm. "This is going to sting, girl," she muttered, soaking a cloth in a basin of hot water laced with something that smelled like eucalyptus. She pressed it to the burn. I bit down on my knee to keep from screaming, a strangled whine escaping my throat. Tears leaked from the corners of my eyes, cutting clean tracks through the grime on my face. "Hold still," Beatrice scolded softly, but her hands were gentle. She moved with practiced efficiency, cleaning the wound, packing it with a pale green salve that smelled of mint and rendered fat, and binding it tightly with clean white linen. Then she looked at my face. She took a fresh cloth, dipped it in the hot water, and reached for my cheek where Clara's ring had torn the skin. As the warm, damp cloth touched my cheekbone, a violent flash of pain spiked through my skull. It wasn't the physical wound, it was a memory, sharp and jagged as broken glass. Cold, freezing, rushing water, the roar of a flooded river drowning out the sound of my own screams. I gasped, my hands flying up to grip Beatrice's wrists. My fingers dug into her forearms. I was falling. The rough stone of a bridge parapet scraping against my palms. A hand on my chest, shoving me backward into the abyss. And on that hand, a heavy, intricate silver ring. Clara's ring. "Girl, girl, look at me!" Beatrice's voice was sharp, cutting through the roaring in my ears. I blinked rapidly, the opulent room coming back into focus. My chest heaved. Cold sweat slicked my spine. It hadn't been an accident. The fever, the amnesia, waking up in the mud, it was the aftermath of attempted murder. I was not born an Omega. I was erased. "What did you see?" Beatrice asked, her voice dropping to a low, urgent whisper. She was studying my eyes, her hand still holding the cloth against my cheek. I let go of her wrists, my hands shaking. The cynical, beaten-down survivor that had been forged in the mud vats over the last week recoiled. I couldn't trust this woman. I couldn't trust Samuel. This pack was a hierarchy built on casual cruelty, where the strong crushed the weak and called it natural law. Whoever I was before the river, she was gone. The woman sitting on this bed was a different creature entirely, a rebirth born of ash and freezing water. Nothing. I lied, my voice flat, devoid of emotion. Just a headache. Beatrice searched my face for a long moment before sitting back. She didn't press. She reached into her satchel and pulled out a small, dark glass vial. "Drink this. It's willow bark and poppy. It will ease the burn and help you sleep." I took the vial, hesitating only a second before downing the bitter, chalky liquid. I needed the sleep. I needed my strength. Because the fragmented memory of Clara's hand pushing me off that bridge had ignited something deep in my chest. It wasn't the warm, fuzzy heat of the mate bond. It was cold, hard, and sharp. It was the desire for retribution. I woke to the sound of low, tense voices filtering through the heavy oak door. My body felt leaden, weighed down by the remnants of the poppy draught. I opened my eyes. The fire in the hearth had burned down to glowing red embers, casting long, bruised shadows across the stone walls. I was still huddled against the headboard, buried under the heavy furs. The linen bandage on my arm felt tight and hot, but the sharp, stabbing agony had dulled to a manageable ache. I pushed myself up, wincing as my stiff muscles protested. I swung my legs over the edge of the high bed, my bare feet hitting the cold stone floor. I was still wearing the torn, filthy shift. The voices outside the door grew louder. "It is a mockery of the old laws, Alpha." Oswin's voice drifted through the thick wood, vibrating with indignation. "You harbor a nameless stray in your personal quarters, while a respected female of high birth rots in the cells. The pack is restless. They whisper that you have lost your mind to grief." I crept closer to the door, pressing my ear against the cold iron hinges. "Let them whisper," Samuel replied. His voice was a low, dangerous rumble. "The mark is authentic. You smelled it yourself, Oswin. Do not play the fool. Even if she carries the mark, look at her!" Another voice chimed in. It was unfamiliar, older, and reeking of aristocratic disgust. "She is broken, feral. She has no lineage, no memory. Aluna must be a pillar of strength, a strategist, a mother to the pack. This creature cannot even look a beta in the eye without cowering. She will disgrace us." I leaned my forehead against the heavy wood, closing my eyes. This creature. The words didn't hurt. They just confirmed what I already knew. The upper echelon of the Winterridge pack was rotten. They didn't value strength. They valued status. They draped themselves in furs and talked of honor, but they built their comfort on the broken backs of the Omegas in the mud vats. I do not care if she was birthed from the mud itself. Samuel's voice snapped, sharp as a cracked whip. The ambient noise outside the door instantly ceased. She is mine. The bond is dormant, but it is real. If any wolf in this territory disrespects her, challenges her, or attempts to undermine her presence here, I will not strip their rank. I will strip their flesh from their bones. Are we understood? Silence. A long, suffocating pause. Understood, Alpha. Oswin finally forced out, the words choking him. Heavy footsteps receded down the stone corridor. I stepped back from the door just as the iron latch lifted. Samuel walked in. He looked exhausted. The deep lines around his mouth were pronounced, and the silver in his dark hair seemed starker in the dim morning light. He stopped when he saw me standing in the middle of the room. His amber eyes swept over me, my bare feet on the stone, the defensive posture of my shoulders, the fresh white bandages glaring against my bruised skin. "You should be resting," he said, closing the door softly behind him. "I've slept enough," I replied. My voice was steady. The panic from the previous night had burned away, leaving a cold, calculated clarity. Samuel frowned, stepping fully into the room. He walked to a heavy wooden wardrobe, pulled out a thick grey woolen tunic, and tossed it onto the edge of the bed. "Put that on. The stone holds the cold." I didn't move toward the bed. I crossed my arms over my chest, mindful of the burn. "Why am I here?" Samuel paused, his hand resting on the back of a heavy oak chair. "You are in my quarters because it is the only place in this keep where I know you will not be touched." "That doesn't answer my question." I pushed, keeping my tone flat. "What do you expect from me? I am not the ghost you are looking for. I am not a Luna. I spent yesterday scraping rotting brains off deer hides. I don't know the first thing about your politics or your pack." Samuel let out a slow, heavy breath, leaning against the chair. He scrubbed a hand over his face. "I don't expect anything from you right now. I expect you to heal." "And Clara?" I asked, watching his face closely. His jaw tightened. "She is confined. Striking a marked mate is an act of treason. The elders will demand a hearing, but I will not let her walk free." I let out a short, dry laugh. It was a harsh, cynical sound that startled even me. Samuel looked at me sharply. "You find this amusing? I find it hypocritical," I said, my voice dropping the deferential tone I had been forced to use for the past week. "She didn't strike your mate. She struck an Omega. And if my collar hadn't ripped, she would be eating roasted boar at your high table right now, and I would be bleeding out in the snow. You don't care about justice, Alpha. You only care about what belongs to you." The accusation hung in the air, heavy and volatile. Samuel stared at me. The golden ring in his eyes flared, a physical manifestation of his temper. I knew I was pushing the boundaries of survival. Weeks of conditioning screamed at me to drop my eyes, to bare my neck, to apologize for the insolence. But I held his gaze. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my chin remained high. The memory of Clara's hand shoving me off the bridge anchored me. I was not going back to the mud, and I was not going to play the grateful, submissive victim for a warlord who turned a blind eye to the cruelty in his own home. Samuel took a slow, deliberate step toward me. Then another. He closed the distance until he was standing mere inches away. I had to tilt my head back to maintain eye contact. The sheer physical presence of him was a suffocating pressure, smelling of ozone and danger. He didn't yell. He didn't raise a hand. He leaned down, his face level with mine. You have a sharp tongue for someone who was shivering in the dirt yesterday, he said quietly, his voice a low, vibrating hum that travelled straight down my spine. The dirt teaches you how to bite, I retorted, refusing to back down. For a long, tense moment, neither of us moved. The air between us cracked with unspoken violence and the jarring magnetic pull of the dormant mate bond. Then, incredibly, the hard line of Samuel's mouth twitched. It wasn't a smile, not quite, but the predatory tension in his shoulders eased a fraction of an inch. He looked at me, not as a broken stray, and not as a fragile ghost, but as something entirely unexpected. Put the tunic on, he said softly, his amber eyes locked onto mine. The elders have convened the council. They want to see the mark in the daylight, and you are going to show them exactly how hard you can bite. The walk to the council chambers was a physical agony. Every step down the winding, draughty stone stairs jarred my burned arm and sent a dull ache radiating from my bruised ribs. The heavy grey tunic Samuel had given me was warm, but the coarse wool chafed against the raw skin of my collarbone. I didn't complain. I focused on the rough texture, using the discomfort to keep my mind anchored to the present. Samuel walked half a pace behind me. He wasn't crowding me, but his presence was a tactical shield. His body heat was a tangible force pushing against the damp chill of the corridor. They will try to break you, he said quietly, his voice barely carrying over the scrape of our boots on the stone. They will use your lack of memory against you. They will demand proof that cannot be provided. And what will you do? I asked, keeping my eyes fixed on the descending stairs. I will tear the throat out of any man who steps towards you, he replied. It wasn't a boast. It was a flat, terrifying statement of fact. I stopped and turned to look at him. His jaw was set, his amber eyes burning in the dim light of the wall sconces. The contradiction of him was dizzying. A warlord who ruled through fear, yet stood here ready to burn his own political structure to the ground for a woman he didn't even know. If you fight them with violence, you validate their claim that you are acting on madness, I said, my voice steady despite the frantic beating of my heart. You rule the fighters, Samuel, but Oswin rules the laws. If we kill him in that room, half the pack will revolt. Samuel's eyes narrowed. You speak of pack politics as if you understand them. I understand bullies, I countered. I spent a week watching them. They only respect power they can't predict. I turned back and continued down the stairs. Let me speak. Do not intervene unless I am about to bleed. The council doors were massive, banded with black iron. Rhaeda stood guard outside. She gave me a long, calculating look, a stark difference from the sneering contempt she had shown me by the mud vats, before hauling the heavy doors open. The chamber smelled of burning sage, old parchment, and the sour tang of nervous sweat. 6 elders sat behind a semicircular table carved from ancient oak. Oswin sat dead center. When I walked in, the silence was absolute. I didn't lower my eyes. I didn't hunch my shoulders. I walked into the center of the room and stood there, the heavy wool tunic falling past my knees. Samuel moved to stand by the wall, arms crossed, effectively blocking the only exit. This is an outrage, an elder named Bram muttered, refusing to look directly at me. Bringing a scullery wretch before the High Council. The Alpha claims she carries his mark, Oswin said, his voice dripping with oily diplomacy. He steepled his fingers, staring at me with a mixture of disgust and dark calculation. We are here to verify this claim. Girl, turn around and bare your neck. My stomach tightened. Being treated like livestock being inspected for slaughter was humiliating, but I needed them to see it. I slowly turned my back to the table, reached up, and pulled the heavy woolen collar down, exposing the nape of my neck. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bone. I felt the collective intake of breath. The raised silvery scar pulsed against the cold air of the chamber. "A burn," Oswin declared smoothly. "A clever brand, inflicted by a rogue or a witch to mimic the Alpha's bite. She has no scent of the Winterridge lineage. She has no memory. She is a vessel of deception." I let the collar snap back into place and turned around. I have enough memory to know who pushed me off the bridge at the Blackwater crossing. The atmosphere in the room shattered. Oswin's smug expression froze. A muscle jumped in his jaw. Bram dropped his quill pen. The distinct smell of ozone flared from the corner where Samuel stood, his wolf instantly reacting to the tension. "What bridge?" Bram demanded, his voice suddenly sharp. "The one where the Alpha's mate supposedly drowned 5 winters ago," I said, keeping my voice loud and perfectly clear. I stepped closer to the table, locking eyes with Oswin. I remember the cold water. I remember the stone parapet. And I remember the heavy silver ring on the hand that shoved me backward into the current. "Clara," Samuel breathed, the word a deadly hiss from the shadows. "Clara," I confirmed, never taking my eyes off Oswin. But Clara didn't act alone, did she, Elder? Because as I fell, I saw a second figure standing in the tree line, a man holding a leather ledger. A ledger detailing the silver the Winterridge pack was supposed to use for winter provisions, silver that never made it to the storehouses. It was a gamble. A massive, terrifying leap of logic based on fractured flashes of memory and the systemic rot I had witnessed in the camp. But as the colour rapidly drained from Oswin's face, leaving him a sickening shade of grey, I knew I had hit the artery. "Treason!" Oswin shouted, slamming his hands onto the oak table, though his voice cracked with sudden, violent panic. "She is raving, a feral creature spinning lies to save her own skin. Bring Clara in," I demanded, raising my voice to cut over his panic. I turned to Samuel. "Bring her here right now." Samuel didn't wait for the council's permission. He jerked his chin at Rada, who was still standing in the doorway. "Fetch her." The wait was agonizing. The chamber fell into a suffocating standstill. Oswin refused to look at me, his eyes darting frantically around the room, while the other elders exchanged nervous, suspicious glances. The scent of Oswin's fear was overpowering, a rancid metallic odor that confirmed every accusation I had just thrown in the dark. 5 minutes later, Rada returned, dragging Clara by the arm. Clara was unrecognizable from the pristine, arrogant woman in the mead hall the night before. Her fine woolen dress was stained with the damp earth of the lower cells. Her hair hung in greasy clumps around her face, and her eyes were wide, manic, and darting. She took one look at the room, at me standing in the centre, at Samuel's murderous expression, and at Oswin's pale, sweating face. And she broke. "It wasn't just me!" Clara shrieked, her voice echoing painfully off the stone walls. She dropped to her knees, pointing a trembling finger at Oswin. "He told me to do it. He said she found the ledgers. He said if she told Samuel about the missing silver from the Bloodjaw trade, he would have us both hanged." Complete, devastating chaos erupted. Bram stood up, knocking his chair backward. "Bloodjaw, you traded our winter silver to our enemies, Oswin." "She is lying!" Oswin bellowed, but he was backing away from the table, his eyes fixed on the heavy iron door. "The Omega is a witch! She has poisoned Clara's mind!" I didn't move. I stood in the center of the storm I had just created, feeling a cold, hollow sense of vindication. This was the hard karma of the river. They had thrown me away to protect their corruption, erasing my identity and leaving me to freeze in the mud. Now their own greed was burning their sanctuary to the ground. Samuel crossed the room in 3 massive, terrifying strides. He didn't draw a blade. He didn't shift into his wolf form. He simply grabbed Oswin by the throat with one hand, lifting the elder entirely off his feet. Oswin choked, his hands clawing uselessly at the Alpha's iron grip. 5 winters, Samuel snarled, his voice a guttural, demonic vibration that shook the dust from the rafters. I tore the forest apart. I buried an empty casket. And you sat at my table and drank my mead. Alpha, wait! My voice was quiet, but it cut through the red haze of his fury. Samuel froze. He turned his head slowly to look at me, his amber eyes completely subsumed by a feral, glowing gold. He was a second away from snapping Oswin's neck. "Don't kill him," I said, stepping forward. The heavy wool tunic dragged across the stone. Death is too quick. Death makes him a martyr to whatever corrupt faction he has built in this pack. I stopped right beside Samuel, looking up at the gasping, purple-faced elder. "Strip him of his rank," I said, my voice cold and flat. "Strip Clara of hers. Take their furs, their boots, and their names. Throw them into the mud vats. Let them scrape hides in the sleet. Let them haul water until their fingers crack and bleed. Let them live as Omegas." Oswin's eyes widened in sheer absolute terror. For a highborn elder, the prospect of the mud vats was a fate vastly worse than the executioner's block. It was a complete, systematic dismantling of his soul. Samuel stared at me. The golden light in his eyes flickered, slowly receding back to the human amber. He looked at the cold, cynical pragmatism in my face, and the ghost of a terrifying smile touched the corner of his mouth. He opened his hand, dropping Oswin to the stone floor. The elder collapsed into a gasping, retching heap. "Redder," Samuel commanded, his voice returning to its normal, deadly calm. "Take them. Put them on the vats. If they stop working, they do not eat." As Rita dragged the sobbing, broken forms of Clara and Oswin out of the chamber, the remaining elders sat in stunned, terrified silence. They looked at me not with disgust, but with a profound, sudden fear. I wasn't a broken stray anymore. I was the architect of their new reality. The heavy oak doors of the council chamber closed behind me, with a hollow, echoing thud. The adrenaline that had kept my spine rigid and my voice steady vanished, leaving behind a cold, sweeping exhaustion. I leaned against the rough-hewn stone wall of the corridor, closing my eyes. The stone leached the meager warmth from my shoulders. My burned arm throbbed, a slow, sickening rhythm perfectly synced with my heartbeat. The air in the hall smelled of damp earth and the lingering, acrid smoke of the braziers. I didn't feel like a victor. I felt like a survivor crawling out of a shipwreck, coughing up seawater, only to find myself stranded on a hostile, frozen shore. There was no grand ceremony to mark my shift in status. I didn't move into the Alpha's sprawling quarters. The thought of sleeping surrounded by the scent of his grief and the oppressive weight of the mate bond made my stomach pitch. Instead, I claimed a small, drafty room near the archives. It smelled of beeswax and old dust. It was safe. It was mine. The real work began in those archives. I spent the next 3 weeks buried in Oswin's ledgers. The room was a miserable, freezing vault. The weak winter sun barely penetrated the narrow, slitted windows, casting long, pale beams across the floorboards. I sat wrapped in a heavy sheepskin blanket, my fingers stained black with ink, tracing the intricate web of Oswin's treason. The tactile reality of his crimes was infuriating. I ran my fingertips over the rough, dried vellum. The ink was faded in places, deliberately smudged in others. It wasn't just the blood-jaw silver. He had skimmed from the grain silos. He had shorted the winter wool shipments. He had built a comfortable, padded life on the frost-bitten toes and empty bellies of the lower camp. I didn't stay locked in the tower. You cannot fix the foundation of a keep by staring at the ceiling. On a Tuesday morning, with the sleet driving down in sharp, freezing sheets, I went back to the tanning vats. The stench hit me a quarter-mile away, the vile metallic rot of mashed brains and lie. My stomach rolled, a visceral biological rejection of the memory. I forced myself to keep walking. The thick mud sucked at my new leather boots with every step. The Omegas were huddled around a pathetic, smoking fire, their hands raw and bleeding as they scraped the hides. Among them, shivering violently in a thin, torn tunic, was Oswin. His hands, once soft and steepled in arrogant contemplation, were blistered and stained yellow with fat. He didn't look up as I approached. He didn't have the strength. I hadn't come to gloat. I signaled to the 2 armed guards pulling a heavy wooden cart behind me. "Unload it," I ordered. The guards dropped the tailgate. Heavy canvas sacks of barley, tightly wrapped bundles of cured mutton, and a dozen pairs of thick, surplus winter boots hit the mud with a heavy, wet thud. The Omegas stopped working. They stared at the pile, their eyes wide, sunken, and deeply suspicious. They looked at me as if I had brought a cart full of poison. "Take them," I said, my voice flat, carrying over the howling wind. "If your feet freeze, you can't work. If you don't work, the hides rot, and I will not have this pack wearing rotting leather because the elders were too cheap to feed you." It wasn't charity. It was cold, ruthless pragmatism. But as a young boy with dirt-streaked cheeks hesitantly reached out to touch the coarse wool of a boot, I felt a sharp, painful ache in the back of my throat. I turned away before anyone could see my expression fracture. Through it all, Samuel was a constant, looming perimeter. He didn't crowd me. He let me dismantle the council, restructure the guard rotations, and overhaul the rationing system. But he was always there, a shadow smelling of crushed pine and ozone. The mate bond was a maddening, persistent gravity. When he entered the archive room, the fine hairs on my arms stood up. When he stood too close, the scarred flesh on the back of my neck grew feverishly hot. We were dancing around a loaded trap, both of us too battered and wary to trigger it. It culminated late one evening, 3 weeks into the new regime. The great hall was mostly empty. The massive iron braziers burned down to glowing, ruby-red coals. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and the faint, sweet tang of spilled mead. I was sitting at the end of a long trestle table, a sprawling map of the Eastern Territory pinned down by 2 heavy iron candlesticks. I was exhausted. My eyes burned, and there was a persistent, dull ache at the base of my skull. The heavy, rhythmic tread of boots announced Samuel before he sat down on the bench across from me. He didn't speak immediately. He reached across the table and pushed a steaming ceramic mug toward me. The scent of hot cider, heavy with cinnamon and sharp cloves, wafted up, cutting through the stale air of the hall. I took the mug, letting the searing heat of the ceramic sink into my perma-chilled palms. "The Bloodjaw pack has sent an envoy," Samuel said. His voice was a low rumble, blending with the crackle of the dying fires. "They crossed the river this morning. They want to renegotiate the border treaties." I stared at the map, tracing the jagged line of the Blackwater River with my thumbnail. They smell blood in the water. They know Oswin is gone. They think the winter has fractured us. "Has it?" Samuel asked, his amber eyes unreadable in the dim light. "Only the dead wood," I replied, taking a slow sip of the cider. It burned going down, a welcome, grounding heat. "But we can't look weak. We need to double the patrols on the eastern ridge tonight. Post archers on the tree line. When the envoy arrives, they need to ride through a gauntlet of armed, well-fed warriors, not a starving, disorganized camp." Samuel nodded slowly. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the heavy oak table. The proximity made my breath catch. He looked exhausted, the silver streaks in his dark hair catching the firelight. But the frantic, violent edge that had possessed him weeks ago was gone. He looked grounded. "They call you the Iron Lunar in the lower camps," he said quietly. I let out a short, dry laugh, the sound harsh in the quiet hall. "They call me a lot of things. Witch is still quite popular among the older sentinels. They fear the witch. They respect the Iron Luna. Samuel corrected. He reached across the map. His large, heavily calloused hand covered mine. I didn't flinch. I didn't pull away. The heat of his skin was a physical shock, a sudden, sharp anchor in the drifting exhaustion of the past 3 weeks. The contradiction of him was staggering. A warlord capable of horrific violence, touching me as if I were made of blown glass. You didn't demand their loyalty, he said, his thumb gently tracing the blue veins on the back of my hand. You bought it with barley and boots. You built it from the dirt up. He paused, the silence stretching between us, heavy and thick. I never thought I would get you back. I spent 5 years clawing at the earth looking for a ghost. I stiffened. The old insecurity, the fear of being a disappointing substitute for a dead woman, flared hot in my chest. I am not her, I warned, my voice tight. The woman who came out of that river is not the girl you marked. I know, Samuel said. The corner of his mouth twitched, a rare, genuine expression that didn't quite reach his eyes. She's entirely gone. The woman sitting across from me is terrifying. She is cynical. She is utterly ruthless, and she has completely dismantled my territory in less than a month. He leaned closer, his gaze dropping to my mouth before rising to meet my eyes again. The scent of him was intoxicating, a wild primal pull that made my pulse pound in my ears, and I have never been more fiercely captivated by anything in my life. I looked at him. I searched his scarred, weary face for a lie, for a romanticized illusion, for the cliché of fated mates blindly falling into line. I found nothing but raw, bleeding honesty. We were 2 broken pieces of machinery, jagged and sharp, somehow grinding together to make the engine run. I didn't offer a soft smile. I didn't whisper a confession. I took another slow sip of the spiced cider, set the heavy mug down on the table, and pulled the parchment map closer. Good, I said, my voice steady, my hand turning over to grip his tightly. Because the Bloodjaw envoy arrives in 3 days, and we have a war to plan. And that is the epic conclusion to the Winterage Pack saga. From the freezing mud to dismantling the highest corrupt authorities, our Omega didn't just survive. She completely rewrote the rules. Did you love this grounded, ruthless take on the werewolf mate trope? If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button and share the video with a friend who loves fierce, brilliant protagonists who fight back. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss our next massive audio drama. What trope should we tackle next? Drop it in the comments.